So we'll move on to the second session. In this session, we'll also have three speakers, and it will be followed by a short discussion. The first speaker is Tim Love. Tim Love is a founding principal of UTIL, an urban design and architecture think tank based in Boston. Among the firm's most notable projects are the New Haven Mill River District Planning Initiative and the Boston Harbor Islands Pavilion. Tim.
I'm actually very comfortable up here because I taught here for 5 years from the spot every Friday. So except for my own house, this is the place where I'm actually the most comfortable. So I guess these are the arrows. Yeah, this is a mashup of all of our projects that we made maybe about a year and a half or 2 years ago. And I think the point of this is that we're very interested in the kind of facts on the ground in North American cities. And specifically, I'm going to be talking tonight about our obsession with the logics of market-driven building types, a category of the built environment that architects that are interested in theory too tend to be less interested in as a general area of focus. Our practice started in 2002, and our business model really was to first focus on a very limited territory in Boston to better understand the politics, the regulatory context, the movers and shakers, and the people that inform the built environment. And so in a way, our business from the beginning was a kind of research project by being as local as possible. So this is a map that we probably made in 2005, but it's still relevant because all of our architectural commissions and all of our planning work are all shown on this map, every single project we had done to date. And so what I wanted to, I think, talk about tonight, given the topic, was to focus on how we've been thinking about market-driven building types by setting up a kind of dichotomy to maybe contrast unique or one-of-a-kind projects, those projects that you might get for a museum or a pavilion for a corporation or a private house, against those projects that could become prototypes for future projects from a typological standpoint. And the interest really is focused on an idea that there are really probably, this is an issue about practice, maybe not about the discipline for a minute, but we believe very strongly three kinds of practices. This is a diagram that Charles Jenks produced in 1977. The first is System 1, the private client. Those are, let's say, patronage-driven projects, whether it's the board of a museum for a private house, or, again, certain kinds of corporate work. Public work tends to be infrastructural projects or state capitals or public libraries. I'm really focusing today on System 3, the developer client, which Jenks denigrates a little bit in his list. I mean, he really implies through the categories there that maybe it's not something that serious architects should focus on. But I would say that in terms of maybe a territory for research and for innovation for architects, maybe it is the richest territory. This is very similar to David's diagrams he had as part of his talk. But I think the relationship between real estate parcels and real estate development strategy and architecture should be much more embedded than it is today. The diagram at the top is the way that the system works today. Parcels are decided by engineers and developers. The easiest projects to do then are the projects that are pulled away through setbacks so that architecture is independent of parcelization. A different model is architecture and parcels in a way being decided, building types and parcels being decided as a kind of simultaneous act. And so the role of the architect to actually make parcelization decisions in terms of real estate development is much more active in the diagram on the bottom than the diagram on the top, where the civil engineer has his own disciplinary neutral territory, and the architect is then free to play on the inside. And I think that some of the houses that David showed get at the same set of issues. I enjoyed David's talk very much. And so a case study are two courtyard houses two courtyard buildings we designed, I don't know, about 5 years ago during the last boom, where, given the parcel sizes in South Boston, we invented a new kind of multifamily housing type for South Boston, although it's an old type, the courtyard type. This is what's called the trolley house, which is a 24-unit project that has parking and lobbies on the ground floor, the courtyard actually on the second floor, and then the units organized around a courtyard. This is about maximizing the value of the land and building up against the maximums of wood frame building code. And then right next door, you can see the building here, phase 2 of that kind of thinking, although the neighborhood made us make the next project a floor lower because they realized after the fact that they let us build too high last time. A project down the street, 321 West 2nd Street, which is also organized around a courtyard, in this case eliminating completely the corridor to maximize net to gross. But once you get above wood frame construction code to high-rise code at 70 feet and above, this is the daydream that every developer has. Whether it's multifamily housing, the double-loaded corridor, or the hotel, maybe a point-load tower if the parcel size requires it, and then the kind of North American classic center core office building. And so the question for our office and for me as an academic is whether architects can actually innovate typologically around these types, or do international real estate investment trusts and the International Building Code point everything back to this diagram. If you look at, for example, an innovative high-rise like Jeannie Gang's Aqua, if you look at it typologically, it's not very much different at all than Mies van der Rohe's Lakeshore Drive apartments from almost 50 years earlier. The only difference is that the building code has required the two means of egress to be further and further apart with each addition, like cell mitosis, but otherwise the diagram is exactly the same. In other words, innovation in this case is only skin deep. So given that as a kind of quandary, when I coordinated the urban design studio at Yale 3 years ago, the dean there gave me some research money to produce a primer for the students before I came, what we called the Urbanism Starter Kit. And what it did is it provided for all of the students all of the typological rules for market-driven building types as if Aldo Rossi worked at SOM for 20 years. That was my pitch to Robert Stern. And so each of the buildings were in a way laid out without the requirement to spend all those years in the firms like KPF, HOK, and SOM to learn the rules. And so they're all there laid out very clearly. And what we did is we built parametric models of a whole suite of buildings and then gave them to the Yale students the first day of class, which was caused some ideological problems, and I can talk about that if you'd like to. But the idea was that because these rules were so ingrained, the students either had to work with the buildings or work intelligently against them, but not ignore the fact that this was part of the DNA of international development. And in a way, if you look at Mies's plan for the IIT campus, that's also a kind of collection of building types too. So the first week of class, the students had to use the buildings out of the box. We used Beacon Yards on the Cambridge-Boston boundary as the site. And so this is one student's proposal. They had to meet the parking ratio. You see a little ghetto of parking garages in the bottom of the plan. This is another student group's proposal. What was nice is that in the very first week of class, the students could actually, with the parametric model, understand exactly what the nature of the problem is so that they could then design. So it allowed for rapid prototyping of master plans to get the students into some metrics that they wouldn't otherwise had. So we've been using, so this is the technique of master planning that we use in our office, that we're using parametric modeling not for customized unique forms, but as a way to rapid prototype master plans when we're thinking about development. I'll show you just two projects that the students did because they're instructive about pushing the limits of what you can do with something that you can't change. This is one student's project which rethought the idea of the kind of active plinth and the high-rise above by disaggregating that to create what she called Jane Jacobs meets Towers in the Park, and with a kind of sponge-like solution for the landscape in between. And the idea is that each building would have an address out at the street with a boardwalk across the sponge to get to the developer office building. So that's one project. The next project laid office buildings across the entire site with the required 30-foot code separation, and then working with a script tying these into the existing street grid, and then setting a rule set that each building would face an open space, created what we ended up calling in the studio Savannah on Acid, if you know the famous Savannah plan. But it allowed the students, because of the starter kit logics, to drill down to a level of specificity for an urban design by, in a way, backfilling the logics of these very robust building types. And then in terms of our own work, we do a lot of work for public agencies, the Convention Center Authority, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the Port Authority, and Mass Development, and now the City of Hartford and the City of New Haven. In a way, we're on-call urban design consultants for all of those agencies. And this is the kind of work we do. We did a study of the Back Bay Commercial District to look at what a new zoning overlay should be. This is from 2007. Here are our favorite building types again, or not our favorites, but the ones that haunt us. As part of the public process, we went hunting for these to prove to the stakeholders that these plan types are everywhere. You can see them. They either are served up purely if the grid is orthogonal, or twisted to the limits of their viability, and came up with a strategy that would repair the kind of missing fabric in this area by identifying the parts of a high-rise. And this is not innovative in any way. The podium and tower is, in a way, a kind of default solution for these kinds of sites. But we wanted to make the point as part of this process that the value is really at the tower. The tower becomes a kind of value thermometer against the expectations of the real estate development community in terms of internal rate of return and the kind of real estate logics. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up on all of the potential redevelopment sites putting a podium in to line up with the adjacent historic buildings. So this is a kind of a condition from which towers could rise. And then we ran both all residential, all office, all residential, and combo platter scenarios against the height limits that were determined by shadows on Copley Plaza and the Commons. So we were able to, in our parametric model, run these things up as high as they could go. And we were able to very quickly for the city provide aggregate real estate value around these, but also kind of test them perceptually. The other project, this is hot off the press, is that we've been doing a lot of consulting with the state about what to do with the track expansion issue at South Station. There happens to be a post office facility in the way. They've been a little bit reluctant to move or make decisions about moving. So we studied a what if, which is what if you dammed Fort Point Channel at the Summer Street Bridge and moved all of the tracks into the channel. And so we were able, by doing that, to get all 20 tracks, which are both the existing and the proposed new, to fit. The grade works. South Station would then be moved so that the South Station would then have, like, arriving in Venice, you know, one of the best views from a train station upon exiting in the world. We then extended the city's 100-acre street plan across the cut of the tracks to Dorchester Avenue. We counted the beans with the real estate. In this case, the heights are being determined by the FAA height limits. which meant the post office could stay around for longer if they wanted to. This was the point. Post office is gone. The bus station is moved, liberating the rest of the terra firma for about 8.6 million square feet of development, which is a lot by Boston standards, but it's not as much as the 20 million square feet of Hudson Yards, but that's a different story. So that in a way is sets that up. I did want to say that we do unique one-of-a-kind projects too. I think many of you in town know that we did the Boston Harbor Island Pavilion on the Rose Kennedy Greenway. I don't have time to go through this because the time up thing is being held up. But the point of this too is that in terms of research, you know, even these projects, and this may be an argument for the disciplinary versus the kind of professional, it comes out of many, many years of interest in research in the performance of roofs. So even a project that is unique as the Harbor Island Pavilion is the result of teaching about these roofs actually as part of my lecture series for 5 years at the GSD. So that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Tim. Next speaker is Carlos Cardenas. Carlos is our own DDES alum and is vice president at the MEME. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. A Cambridge-based consultancy focusing on strategic and creative integration of research, design, and technology. Recent projects range from envisioning a better washing machine interface through human-vehicle interaction to the post-smartphone camera. Carlos.
Thank you. I guess I'll start by describing a little bit the way we explain what we do, and I think it's to the point of the question of the topic today. When people ask us the type of work, especially my former colleagues back in Colombia as traditional or as practicing architects, and I try to describe it, I usually say the words experience, design, and innovation. And that's something that is important because, let me see how this works. Oh, got it. So I try to explain to them that this is a research-based practice, and that we do is research. And it's very interesting because the origin of the firm has its roots here in the GSD. It started, and the 3 slides that I'm going to show next is current directions or the core of the things that we do research on today to help organizations. But it was also some of the most interesting questions that emerged from what we're learning and the surprising things that we were finding here at school. So one of the key things is the fact that technology is changing our lives at an amazing speed and changing very quickly how to design for that life. And I think that in that case, how can designers be up to speed and help shape that future? That was an important question for us. And the other aspect of it is that it's a matter of understanding those technologies and how they come together to do interesting things. It's also the core of our work has been in consumer electronics, but we've done work in many other areas. And a lot of these organizations are very, very large companies that have been looking at let's say, the design problem from a very quickly evolving dynamic, from having to focus on very discrete problems of specific products to having to understand how those products live beyond the essence of the product. And this chart is trying to explain a little bit of that path that I think even ourselves have been going through, from the initial project that we started working on that were very focused on the idea of how to design. It's a product design problem, and having to understand that the value of that product is no longer in the product itself in many cases, and for the company, how they need to consider an extended ecosystem of ideas and design directions and problematics that they traditionally are not used to thinking about, or that are not necessarily the specific problems or of the groups that come to us for help. So in that case, also a very important aspect, and this is nothing new, but the idea of user-centric design and re-understanding people. But this immediately connects to culture at many levels, organizational culture, ethnographic culture, the idea of how the manifestation of how we live makes perfect sense or not, and it's changing due to what was in previous slides. But it's also how to understand those things at a deep level and use them as material, if you want, in a sense. How to understand those things at a deep level, have disciplines that are associated and are tangential to design, but that feed a lot of knowledge on people's motivations, values, and that help. I mean, this is nothing new for product design, but I think in this case, or in many other disciplines, but I think that specific questions of how to do that when you're thinking about very quickly shifting lifestyles and forms of engaging engaging in ways in which people use or connect with products, and the speed of that being accelerated was something that we're very interested about. So these are the three core areas or pillars of what we call research. And I have to clarify or explain a little bit that in the past 6 years since the company started, due to the fact that we've been working with organizations that have, in most cases, or at least probably 75% of our work has been with organizations that have armies of designers themselves, have large groups of designers that take our ideas and make them happen. We are very on the early stages of the process, and that has produced some limitations of what we traditionally would call design. So we're, in other words, we are kind of in a strategic phase of the design process. So I'm going to show 3 examples on how this, two examples of let's say client-driven projects, and another one that connects to a little bit of the discussion that was previously happening about how do we push ourselves to do research. Even though we are a research-based practice, a lot of the times we're very frustrated, or not frustrated, but limited by the questions or the problematic that the client brings to the table. How do we push ourselves to go beyond that for many purposes? And I'll explain that in a second. So the way that the client brought the problem to us was cameras are dying or cameras are changing. The small point and shoot is being absorbed by the smartphone. Nobody buys anymore this type of product. Everybody has a smartphone with an amazing camera. And the super high-end, professional, expensive $2,000 cameras are now, a lot of those features are being transferred to more affordable cameras that are more portable. So how do we tell us how to design the next camera? And a very specific, of course, target segment, who is the consumer for this product. And they had very clear ideas of who this user was. 2 groups, one that was heavily using the phone to take pictures and socializing their images through services, and people who had an aspiration to become a professional photographer. Not a professional, but a pro amateur. So we did a lot of the study of products and how people are using phones to take cameras, but we quickly started really understanding who if this representation of the consumer was real, or how could we understand that a little bit deeper. So we did, a typical ethnographic study. We interviewed them at their home. We understood the ecosystem of product they use, how they live, and in some cases we were able to follow them on where they took photographs, understand what was their process. This group of people were very carefully selected, and interestingly through social media, because there were very specific ideas on who they were as photographers that needed to be solved. And what we found was really interesting. The capturing, editing, and sharing process of the images was something that was not necessarily considered by the client. In other words, digital images, being the rule now, are producing a different motivation for why people take photographs. In this case, what we found was instead of photographers, they were becoming participants in imaging cultures, and the camera was a mean to produce the token for that, or the currency for that experience, which was the image. But it was an image, in this case, for example, a story of a person who was very keen into taking photographs of food and sharing. In this, there's been a proliferation of spaces to share images. And what's important to her was being able to tag the image and everything that she could share in the community of that photograph. So instantly we started understanding how the meaning for the camera and the image was not necessarily the traditional one. And it was the experience of taking a photograph or of imaging was very different for those forces that were pushing it. In this case, several stories or several directions. One was the idea that the camera disappears or becomes almost impervious to the process, and a casual image in the sense that the camera becomes part of the environment, to the point that we heard people saying, I don't take pictures, I don't take my camera anymore when I go to parties, especially with my friends, because I know there'll be 20 pictures of myself shared. I don't need to worry about imaging anymore. So, or the problem of millions of images available and you being able to produce at the same time, producing massively quantities of images. How do you organize them? How do you not only edit them, but also the capturing process? We were talking about people who were saying, interesting enough, that they're more concerned about how to sort this problem of many images. So two of the concepts of the many concepts we produced was that idea of the camera that disappears. Instead of the camera being a precious object, a disposable object, and it's not a new idea, but the idea that a disposable object could be a social device that connects to the phone instead of fighting with the phone, and that is part of an ecosystem that makes that idea of a stealth. So how do you capture with an image that has no shutter, that has no viewer? And there were several ideas on how that could be automated or done differently. And to the right, make the camera more like the phone. And this is a 2-year-old project, but there are already cameras that are connected and all, et cetera. But in this case, we were suggesting services that run in the camera. For example, for people who don't want to capture an image, you just stand and point to some place and you upload the images on that site, get geographically located, and you can instead choose and curate your pictures because you don't think the capturing is as important. So again, that idea of the technology changing a problem in the market, understanding the consumer, comes together to produce a different way of solving the problem. And here, a similar approach, a similar challenge, but a little bit different product. This is about kitchens and a system of home appliances. So the speed of change is a little bit different, but still permeation of digital technology. How is it going to change the future of this? And we took a different approach. This is a way in which we pushed a little bit of a different agenda to the client. We thought it would be interesting to really understand and take an opportunity the history of cooking and food culture, particularly in the US. And we did it as part of the project, and as soon as we showed this to them, they became hugely interested. So because we were finding that what we were getting from ethnographic research and traditional methods was not helpful enough. And we took this sort of a very broad timeline approach, an era approach at 2 scales. One was the whole culture, but the other one was the appliances themselves. We used advertising as an analysis of advertising to understand social issues, how the branding of these products was done, what were the values around the product, and we saw interesting changes from, this is during the war period, a lot of economic issues and the role of gender roles, versus the idea of what the product, in this case, family values and all the potentials of new materials being, nobody would buy a refrigerator like this, but at the time it was very, very trendy. So we also looked at a shorter period of time, but more close to the product, more sort of a genealogy of product details. And we use this as a way to think about the challenge of designing for this. And we added other types of digital media or other influences in digital culture that could permeate the problem. And in this case, we very specifically thought, how do we apply this knowledge? So we were coming up with ideas on how these trends and these directions would be of service in designing these products. And there were 2 levels. One, a sort of a general strategy of how this would behave. And one is more digital and everything that we learned from what it should represent in a contemporary kitchen and the values of the cooks today. But also, so there were issues about, for each appliance, aspects of how it should work in this context of an integrated kitchen that borrowed from that knowledge. And just quickly, because the time up sign has been raised, a different way of how we push ourselves is we find interesting topics of research, and we've developed a habit of doing at least once a year a series of workshops in which we decide the topic and invite people to the office and do a lot of interesting work. In this case, the future of banking, the idea that with a lot of digital services being able to be done outside the branch, how is the physical space changing? So we did a 2-day workshop. We brought people from the industry, designers, architects, to discuss service, not the space, and how digital media is changing that. And we came up with an interesting exercise of studying, making case studies of companies that are doing that already, financial companies that are rethinking their space, and starting studying a little bit of typologies of how at a human scale that is happening, so where the interactions happen outside of the personal devices. And started developing also a sort of a process of discussing different types of service narratives that could live in those spaces, and develop sort of a kit of parts or a system of modules that could be recombined to rethink service, in which the little lighter green screens that you see would be where people would interact, and develop different styles or different models of service, in which the space of the bank would be a social space, would be open to the community. So how would that then be a space for interaction with digital services at the branch to change the nature of what happens there? And just to close with the practice, so on the left-hand side, a lot of the groups that we deal with when we do consulting work, and a lot of the initiatives that we try to take ourselves that have also changed how the research that we do in both camps inform and give opportunities to do different things.
Thank you, Carlos. The last speaker in this panel will be Michelle Kwasny. Michelle is a design researcher at IDEO Boston. IDEO is an award-winning global design firm that takes a human-centered, design-based approach to complex challenges in fields as diverse as energy, environment, financial services, food, health, and organizational behavior. Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle, design researcher at IDEO. I've been there about 3 years. My background is in psychology, market research, and usability. So I've kind of zigzagged through a bunch of different research styles, and I'll talk about that a little today. So IDEO, if you don't know it, it's a global design consultancy, and we go for innovative products. So we have a lot of different people, very multidisciplinary, working together. Anything from mechanical engineering to human factors, like me, design research, or food science, so designing the future of fruit snacks, let's say. And we do a lot of different work. And I sort of took the lens for this presentation through the topic of this symposium, Convergence. So I wanted to look at what convergence and divergence means for me as a design researcher. This is sort of a typical flow through a process. We start, maybe with insight, getting inspired, going out and talking to people, humans, and doing a little bit of ideation, ideas, right? And then ending up with some sort of execution, right? It doesn't always happen this way, but typically that's the way we do it. And there's some sort of artifact at the end of the day, like, maybe it's a new beer can, maybe it's an injection device, you name it, we do it. But each of these has sort of a process of diverging and converging. So whether it's one big divergence in terms of insight and then synthesis, or whether it's an individual diverging, looking at new things and then converging with them within themselves. Each of us is doing it, and I think I heard this theme come up over and over in other speakers. So my argument today, and the topic of this symposium is convergence, but my argument is that divergence is really the most important thing that we can do, see new things, challenge ourselves to think in new ways. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. So how does IDEO do that? How do we go broad? How do we diverge? And I'm using market research as a comparison here just because I tend to think of them as the most convergent way of doing research. So as opposed to market research, they focus on demographics, looking at people through the lens of certain age profiles, gender profiles, things like that. We go and talk to individuals and see what their life is like. So the woman on the right here, we went to talk to her because we were designing something for rheumatoid arthritis. You can tell she has it pretty badly. And we said, do do you have any problems with your medications, opening them? You know, your hands are pretty gnarly. And she said, no, I have no problem at all. And we said, oh, well, you know, can you show us how you open them? And this is what she showed us. She walked over to her bread slicer and just cut the top right off so she can get in it. And it's not until you sit with someone and sort of experience that you really get a sense of what these people go through. While market research focuses on typicals, you know, the center of the bell curve, we go and look at extremes. So I saw a few examples of looking into the environment for different ways things are done. This is our way of doing that. So when we designed this set of kitchen tools at the bottom here, we went not only to look at your average woman or man in the kitchen in their household, but we talked to chefs, people who hate to cook, kids and how they cook, how they hold things, just to get a really diverse spread of different individuals. So while market research collects through some sort of scripted, sort of very narrow survey or focus group, we try and follow those little threads of conversation that people give us. So engaging people in some sort of dynamic conversation, and usually through the means of pictures or worksheets, things like that, just so we can have a shared understanding of what everyone is saying. And here we're doing research in a place where English is not the first language, so pictures become even more crucial there. Again, market research, objective data on explicit needs. We try to go for those latent needs, so especially when you're trying to go for something innovative, right? You don't just want to look at what people are already using and saying today. Often what people say and what they do is very different than what they think and what they feel. So getting beyond their actions and really tapping into their thoughts and their feelings is really important. And this is one example. So instead of just going to talk to people in controlled settings, we go out there, we experience what people do. Much like probably when you designed the boathouse, you went and you looked at boats, you maybe even rode in one. That's exactly what we do. This is my colleague Stacy observing an OR procedure in its full glory, and using that to design better OR tools. But not only do we go into people's environments, we go out and look into the world for different analogous things. So in that same project where we were designing OR tools, we said, you know what, an OR is really about, or even an ER in this case, it's really about, you know, I'm sitting there and a mess just rolls in, I gotta take care of it, and then I gotta get it to where it needs to go, right? And so a pit crew, perfect example of that. You know, you blow a tire or something's wrong, we don't know what, rolls in, they gotta deal with it and gotta get it on the road. So in this case, it actually led to an innovation in terms of tool organization. So the doctors in the ER used to have their tools organized in terms of use. So it was like, you know, here's this tool, tool A, tool B, instead of for purpose, right? So this pit crew had like the tire kit and the engine kit and things like that. And so we took that back into the ER and it worked really well, even though there was some duplication of tools. Okay, so that's sort of traditional research. That's what we have always done and will always do. We find it very useful. But there's 4 sort of emerging themes that I wanted to present today, just because we're seeing these bubble up over and over. And this first one is about extreme inspiration. So looking at people in different ways. This project was a hospital, again, looking at their intake process. And when the team went out and they interviewed patients, they said, wow, this is really like chaotic, it's a mess, they're being asked questions, they don't even know why, they're being asked to wait in places and they don't even know why. We really have to show the client this chaotic mess. How are we gonna do that? So they said, well, we can't really take them into their own hospital. We can't really show them the patients because of regulations, things like that. Let's create an empathetic immersion for them to really feel it. So they set up a fake restaurant in a Brooklyn food kitchen, and they hired actors play as the waitress and maitre d'. And they did just chaotic things to them, right? Everybody has to wear a lobster bib. Why? I don't know. You have to wear it. Take off your shoes. Well, why? Put on these, paper slippers. Okay, well, why am I doing this? The picture on the left is really interesting. People, when they're in the intake process, sometimes get hooked up to an IV, and they just wait and wait and wait, and they can't move because they can't move the IV. They're just waiting for someone to come help. And so on the left there, you see a woman with her 2 fingers up on the table and a wine glass being balanced on her hands. And that simulated that IV process down to a T. So these clients that were in this immersion came out and said, wow, I did not know that this was the problem at all. And they've seen it over and over. They've gone to their process, but until they experienced it, the light didn't turn on. Okay, so we're noticing research getting shorter and longer. So time is of the essence. We're doing interviews through Skype and FaceTime, things like that, rapid ethnography, but also longer term research. So this was a team looking at Saturday morning newspaper readership in Canada. And so they said, instead of just going to someone's home on a Saturday morning and saying, hey, we're the design team, it's nice to meet you, let's read together, that's kind of weird. They said, wow, let's really get to know these people, let's stay the night. So they went on a Friday night, they stayed over, they had dinner with the family, they learned all about the family, the kids, and played with, tucked them in, things like that. And they woke up together with the family on a Saturday. And they just went through like normal activity with the family. And it was so much richer that way than coming in just for that 90-minute interview or whatever. We're also seeing research get closer to market. So live prototyping has been a hot topic for us. On the left, you're seeing some in-context prototypes using cardboard, moving things around real time. On the right is a project about snack food. And the team designed all these new packages for snack food and went into a grocery store and set up a kiosk and just let people shop it for a while and figured out, asked people what they're looking at, had people explain what they were seeing, and they learned a lot more that way. So getting closer and closer to market and getting things out there. And then lastly, I think I've heard this as a theme today too, but combining forces. So I don't think I can just be a design researcher anymore. I need an extra. I need to be a storyteller. I need to be an interaction designer. I need to be something beyond. So this is an example of telling the story of mammography for women who've been through breast cancer. I mean, it's a pretty serious topic. And so this is really an example of design research and deep insights and a communication design or graphic designer and that deep storytelling coming together and telling the client, telling the world what these women go through. So storytelling, there's other ways that we're combining forces. So hybrid insights is what we're sort of calling the mishmash between qualitative and quantitative work. So business designers coming together with researchers to make new business models and new business sub-businesses for companies even. So a lot more of this to come, and I'm sure it's already happening academically too. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Right on time. And now to the discussion. Speakers, please take your seats. The discussion will be led by Iñaki Abalos, a founding principal at Abalos and Kievich Architectos. The firm's work merges design research, offering a synthesis of technical rigor, formal imagination, and discipline integration between architecture, environment, and landscape.
Thank you. Well, I saw the first panel, Paul, having difficulties in dealing with this as a moderator in this panel, and it's exactly the same for me. It's quite difficult to try to establish a kind of common ground or a kind of basis for a serious discussion. My first, let me just speak 1 minute, and then I begin to to make you some questions. So I think that my first take is about what's the aim of the DIDAS students in bringing here this idea of research as practice? How these, what we have seen is linked to what in this school is being made for as doctorates in design or masters in design. No? So I think that it would be important to hear you trying to really connect what you are doing here and what they are doing outside. No? This is the first thing, because I think for me, the idea of research is like it's a historical idea. I mean, it is not something new, as you have mentioned, Paul. But I also have this I mean, maybe it's a stupid or banal discussion, but I think that the difference among, let's say, PhD or DIDAS can be in the of the research. I think that one thing is research and the other is search. And I'm in search, which is much more focused and much more direct, much more focused in let's say, in practical agencies. No? And what we have seen here is something that in many ways can be seen as that. But I would like to ask you, first of all, no, if you, how exactly the same question that Paul has made. How do you describe your relationship with the, let's say, the standard practice of architecture in the States?
I'll speak to that, but also to the, I mean, being a DIDAS alum, I think I kind of experienced the process. It was very interesting because when one of the key, and I think Nathan was mentioning it when he was talking about the way that differentiates with other programs, is that the fact that it's sort of applied or it has an implication of being closer to certain aspects of practice and in a process. So let's say, I speak first to my journey and then how I think it relates what we do. In my case, the type of research I was doing here at the school was focused on architecture, but I was looking at issues of practice in architecture through digital media. And in parallel, I had been working at school in other places with the idea of digital digital revolution, changing industries, changing forms of making, changing ways of communication. And I think those two things blended at a point where I believe it's very connected to an architectural practice, from the point of view of seeing how current that is today, on how practices are redefining themselves. I think your allusion to parametric modeling and using tools that have origin in other types of industries and freely using them to measure other things and to experiment other things is a simple example. But in my case, I think what I felt was really interesting after I finished was the fact that all the flexibility that the program provided and all the discussion of being able to design your own research program and the way that you should sort of converge and diverge until you find a specific problem, and then be able to link that to an application or two. I think that journey was something that I found connected to the program, and something that I found when joining and starting the firm. Finding a way to connect that skill and that experience to how do you help organizations or help discover areas in design where that process will be helpful and will help redefine things.
I want to add something to the same question. Do you relate your practice more to the concept of design than to the concept of architecture?
But I think that maybe this is answering for all three of us, but it's an issue of agency in a way, because the traditional architect has a fairly passive position against others that decide what the problem is to solve. Or the traditional role of the architect is to wait until there's an RFP or a problem, the brief is written, there's a target for a budget and the space program, and then the architect, it's a game where they do the best they can within those parameters. And I would say that as a general generational condition of maybe broad range of generations here, but the idea that everybody who spoke, I think, was interested in being at a different place in the food chain in terms of this issue of agency, which is to, even redefine what the question is in very different ways. So I think that's a very important issue in relationship to kind of traditional ideas about practicing architecture.
Yeah, in a way, I think that very much the focus is in designing the practice. As a project, as a real project. Can you?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, I don't know anything about architecture. I learn it when I work with a space designer or environmental designer, very much like I learned like mechanical engineering when I worked on a project that required that. So like I totally love the kitchen sink example that came up earlier, because that's sort of what my daily life is. But to this point, I mean, I think everything that we do is a series of unknown outcomes, an unknown process. So if we're doing something with a known outcome, we need to broaden it so that we can have that exploratory process or that divergence to be able to find what the proper outcome should be.
Yeah. But also, yep, right. But I think that in maybe it's purely casual, but both of you have, the three of you have made a kind of emphasis in a kind of reinvention of the subject, or redescription, not invention, but redescription of the subject, which is something that always philosophically and in architectural terms has happened in history again. I mean, every new take on or any new, let's say, cultural wave or whatever you call it, has to begin in a way to reconstruct, modifying the way we describe the subject in order to really apply new techniques to that. And the war behavior has been mentioned a couple of times by you, and it was implicit in your typology, Russian typologies, no? And I mean, your focus on the developer as a key figure, no? that plays the game. No? Do you think that this is a kind of I mean, it's casual, or it's a crucial aspect of your way to understand research or your search?
But I think that maybe our focus is to maybe pointed back to the audience in a way, is to say that this category of building production is as worthy of intense research and scrutiny and invention, which is seemingly still resistant to that, than much more flexible building types, because of the regime under which developers make decisions. The 27 categories of building underwriting that sets the financeability of a developer-driven project, or the 45-foot lease dimension from the core to the window wall, which is embedded in the systems furniture on a 5-foot grid. I mean, I was thinking, how would IDAO work with us on a project like this? But the systems of metrics are so embedded that you'd have to have a client of 30,000 people that included furniture manufacturers and real estate underwriters, and to even get the group together to even rethink the system is so deeply ingrained across so many industries. And so how would, I guess my question is, how would IDEO crack the case?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the analogy for me is healthcare, right? Like, how do you make so one of my projects was redesigning the infusion process. Somebody who has RA has to go get infusions once a month. Like, how do you improve their life? And part of it is like, what insurance are they on? What where do they live? What city are they? There's all these, like, every project we dive into has a set of standards and has its own really embedded exactly problems. So I don't know, but I think it's all about learning where the walls are and where you can push walls down. as a metaphor.
I would kind of relate it to the previous question as well, thinking about how do you refine the question and how do you, I think in many cases, the problem would be if you're thinking about a thesis dissertation, the ultimate goal is to produce new knowledge, right, and produce a contribution in a field. And I think it's analogous to this idea of this ambition for innovation and discovering a new way of something that can spark a different form that becomes meaningful. And I think that there's a parallel in that, in the approach of you're constantly redefining the question. By many cases, you really have to focus very narrowly on a problem, but if you look in tangential areas, there's something that sparks a discovery.
Yeah, but I think that maybe what I'm realizing is that part of that ability to innovate is to know the existing system so well, not just the facts at hand, but the underpinnings of all of the logics, whether it's, this thing you talked about that I don't know, or a dishwasher. You can't innovate until you understand the deep structure of the logics of the existing type. And so I would say that what binds all the talks is a fundamentally kind of typological understanding of kind of solutions.
This is it. I mean, I understand in your case, but not in other cases. Other cases, I work with empathy, work with other tools. No, I think that the key. I mean, I'm going to open the discussion now, but I think that the idea that Carlos is suggesting is more open in the sense that it relates, as he has said, no, the kind of work of research that Adidas can make in this school or in other places, but especially in this school, is more about, I would say, proposing a size, not tentative size, which is a different gender than the historical, super rigorous PhD stuff, no? And Isai is something that is persuasive, but is never demonstrated. I mean, the rhetorics are key in the success of the Isai, while the PhD has to be like systematic and controlling all the information. And I think that what you are doing, or what we have seen here today, is more related with, and also as you have pointed out, an Isai is so similar to a conventional project of architecture. I mean, the idea that you are projecting something, you are like trying to see if it is going to success, but you don't have any kind of rigorous method to tell you, to inform you about the possible success, even if you try to have that. No? So in a way, I think that this can be a kind of thing that we leave on a little cloud or on top of us, and we open the discussion to the public, to the audience. Yeah, please.
I guess this is a question for both of the panels, because I thought there was I'm sure it was intentional, where as designers, we have a connection to the things that we make. And the first panel was talking a lot about how research informs our products and how you somehow create themes that would carry you from one product to the next in your research. And this panel seems a lot more about recognizing that we're essentially a service industry and more researching the process. So I'm curious if it's just coincidental what your firms are doing, or if there's a debate between the two panels about where research should be focused, on the process or on our products.
It's a question for all six. It's a question for all six of us. I mean, for us, as a firm that's engaged with the discourse quite a bit, we are self-conscious about maybe a different focused analysis. I mean, putting it directly, we were in the same class here at the GSD, and we talk all the time, but I think that we both acknowledge we have, within the discipline of architecture, almost an opposite focus on at least intellectually what we think about, but people are different.
Very good response. Yeah, I don't understand the or. No? Can be and. No?
I was going to say that the distinction, especially is separating I think there was a lot of process in what was shown in the first panel, very intentionally and very experimental at the same time. And what I found interesting was that in many cases, even in the experimental, there were very intentional rules, but the experimentation came from the processing of those rules and seeing what happens. I think in there's an analogy, especially I speak for myself in what we do. There's less of experimentation in that regard until you have enough information to do so. Basically, you have to set up the constraints and parameters, and we try to fight against the ones that, not fight, but we try to add to the ones that are given to us to explore in a different way. And that's, I think, I see there the relation between the two. In other words, a simple example, people, where we describe the target segments, we can, like, I agree with you, can see people that way. It's not conducive to any interesting idea about how people are going to do anything. So how do you think that, and about that similar way that, you know, we would change the rules about how Manhattan relates to topography, set up a system and see the result, and it's surprising. Both things are surprising.
Other questions?
Here. Hi, so I have a question for Carols, and maybe possibly Michelle can weigh in. I will ask this question with all my respect, but it will be a little bit harsh question. So in my other life, I used to be working a big German company, and we have many designers globally. And I work, and so in your perspective, I'm one of the army of the designers. I'm maybe a soldier. In the beginning, we always hire some of the big design consultancies and to give us some of the insights of the industry. But eventually we stopped doing that. And there are two reasons we find that is, one of them is we think that critique is very easy, but make is hard. And in our perspective, the design consultancy, we don't see them making designs. We don't see them making business choices, and we don't see them take risks. And so in that sense that they don't produce real tangible things. And from our perspective, the designs we make are sell in Home Depot, in Amazon, and when we see the reviews from real people, and we see our values are passed. Hello? And the second reason is that we think, so in your perspective, you're delivering ideas, you're delivering directions for a company. But in our perspective, we think that ideas are cheap. The reason is we think there are tremendous craftsmanship between an ideas to a real product. And sometimes we think it's even more than 99% of the work. And so I guess overall, I want to say the question is, besides delivering a report, what do you see as the value of doing that? And again, with all my respect.
Sure, no, and it's a great question. So maybe I can explain a little bit and clarify and it's an issue about craft and how you create an idea, right? I would say that, for example, partially this last slide was talking about those two, the client base and why we work. We usually work with product planning teams, marketing teams, very early stages on. And the questions they bring are mainly with Asian companies, and a lot of the questions they bring are specifically about the US market. So there's a lot of value in really going deep and trying to understand the nuances of how consumers are going to react to a product. But beyond that, a lot of times I've sat down in meetings where they come up with a problem, and this is more part of organizational culture. Let's say they sat us down and we have 5 different product divisions and they're forcing us to work together. Basically, they're saying we need to come up with a convergence project, but each division has an interest. So I think the value that we bring and the quote on, or the comment on armies of researchers was never to demean the work. The opposite. A lot of our work has been to inspire researchers and designers. And so, for example, back to the question of the siloed and 5 groups of product designers having to work together in ways they never worked before. They come to us more as a place to congeal, to be able to join efforts, but also to understand how that has happened elsewhere, and how that can be done in an interesting way for the way that a specific market understands a product like that. And to the other side, for example, the project when we were talking about the history of the U.S. cooking, I think that was amazingly valuable for the designers. And for example, it's very hard for us to put on the map where our contributions is on the final product, and that's why we try to do things on the left side of the last page list. But we know that, for example, after we do follow up on the project and we try to see where did our report end up, and that was really valuable for this group of the strategic group that was dealing with that project, but also the designers themselves were able to link to understand a little bit better why certain things that they didn't understand didn't work when they bring, for example, if you go to Japan or Korea, you see refrigerators with pattern flowers on the doors. You will never sell that in the US. You will never sell that in Europe because that's not a taste. You can tell them that because you do the research and they are able to do better design. So I think that's where we add value.
I think that Michelle.
I just have one small thing to add. I totally agree with what you're saying, wholeheartedly. I think the intent of us working with a client is like you were saying, is to inspire. And oftentimes we're the only group that can talk to all of those different factions in an organization and give them all one mission. I think the other value is that oftentimes we sit down in a conference room and we see a very narrow line of thinking and not a lot of risk on our client's part, actually. And so that's why things like live prototyping, getting out and showing it to people, getting them to prototype in a store, in an environment, and actually having people experience it sooner, even though it's not fully baked, that's hugely impactful to many of our clients, and they start doing it themselves. So while I agree that like taking it over the finish line, that last 1% is probably 80% of the work, there's value to this stuff too.
More questions? Yeah, please.
After hearing all the conversations, we presented this idea at the beginning that was the kind of concept that design process and research are often intertwined to mean the same thing in architecture, and that's true, I think, in industrial design and a lot of product development strategies. And to be honest, after seeing all the presentations, I kind of feel like what we're talking about is a rigorous design process. Like you're talking with the IDO processes and looking at what the real problem is that needs a solution that results in a new product. Or with what Carlos is presenting, where you're advising clients on the development of new product that through basically rigorous design process. And I wonder, at what point does separating research from design process and kind of the nomenclature start to break down actually the value of a rigorous design process, and by separating the research out? To me, it's starting to sound like, even with the development, like with the boathouse, a lot of this is kind of rigorous design process, looking at materials and modes of assembly and these things to solve certain design problems.
Yeah, but I think that it's the research that you do. It's a good question, but I think the research that you do just beyond the limits of the design problem itself is that added value, whether it's consumer research or researching the metrics of financial analysis in our case, which are things that allow for innovation, because it again is the underpinnings of even the brief, and so that's how I would distinguish
and that
it.
You would separate. I guess the question would be, if you're going outside of the normal boundaries of what's expected. First question is kind of an aside, but is that not really what the design process is supposed to be about if you're rigorously approaching it? But second, how does the feedback loop? How does that going outside the boundaries? Sometimes there has to be a feedback loop for it to be a research. Otherwise, you have a product and you move to the next thing. So how within your firm, and I guess it's a question for everyone, how do you feed the results of the research feedback into the next process? Are you kind of constantly incrementally improving your process, your product, and achieving new results? Or is it about disseminating the knowledge to kind of, whether it's a planning strategy or product development strategy, expanding this to kind of the broader scope? Because it seems like these are all questions that we have to deal with in terms of what is research versus what is kind of a design project. And I wonder how that fits in. I mean, because it's still ambiguous, I guess, in my mind.
Well, it's accruing knowledge, so that it's back to the issue of agency, where the accruing knowledge means that you're, in our case, more impactful further upstream, which is, setting, land use policy, or so I I mean, everyone's going to have a different answer, but I think that it's transcending the expertise of the architect to have, in our case, more less hope positive influence on development decisions, which aren't usually the purview of an architect. But I think that that's a very different answer than maybe the deep dive of IDEO, which develops an expertise. I don't know. Are you kept on retainer then for certain industries, or
Sometimes. This makes me think that like 100 years ago, when I was, my ancestors were living on a farm. Like, they had to figure it out and make it and repair it, and they were the designers and researchers in and of themselves. And as we've gone forward in time, those roles have been segmented out and broken out. And I think we're coming back, or on our way back to converging again. And I'm often asked what I make, because our culture is so much about making at my office, and I really struggle with that. Like, as a researcher, what do I make? And I loved, I forget who said it earlier. It's like the research is the design, right? So I make the product at the end of the day, even though I don't do 3D modeling, because so much of my the insight that I help the team find makes it into the final design.
To evaluate this, then, if there's once the product, and this is kind of whether the product is a plan or a building or an actual product, what is the feedback loop then once the product is out to market? That seems to be where all the research seems to lead up to this kind of moment where this thing is released. Validation. And then how does it feed back then, so you actually know if all of this work you've done to develop this kind of very complex, well-informed solution is actually successful.
Yeah, and I hope that moment isn't like the culminating moment. Like, we strive to show it and get it out as much as possible throughout the whole process. So I would hope that even in architecture, maybe, that plans would be shown and things would be socialized, so that that moment isn't so much of a risk anymore. But in terms of success, I think it's looking back at what we strive to do in the first place and sort of seeing if that is actually happening. But
and in our experience, there's three feedback loops that I can think of. One is we've had a few times in which there have been recurring clients in which we see that the knowledge has advanced, and it's a different group from the same team, and they bring we see the foundation of things we've built, because they come with problems that they even tell us, it's based on a previous project, but you see that making progress. The second one is in some project we've been able to do early stages a test, so actually test it with users, and it's not the final product, but there's a sense of you actually have some quantifiable result if what you were suggesting would work. And the third one is for ourselves, and it goes back to designing the practice, because a lot of that is constrained by the boundaries of the client. So the banking exercise was something which we were trying to, it has no client yet, but the idea is that we will develop something out of that can become a product or a service, or and it's that also fits. I mean, it's successful for us.
Mm-hmm. I think that we are in time, and I would just like to add that in historical terms, I want to come back to this. I mean, what we have heard today has been attempted for centuries, and I can imagine the aims of Alberti and a little bit later of Palladio trying to use new technologies in order to redesign processes and products at the same time, and making research on that. No? So one had to deal just with words, the other had the opportunity of adding drawings, and that changed the nature of their texts and their objectives. So I think that it's always good to see and discuss what is happening now, and I think that I would invite everyone to establish like bridges in time that give a kind of more amplified sense of what we are discussing. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Paul, you weren't.
I would just offer is that maybe the difference now than maybe in the Renaissance is that we have to deal with mass culture I mean, a truly 9 billion people is different. I think the scale of change that
We are also 9 million architects.
right, but the scale, the impact of the scale of global change means that the known frontier of our ignorance grows more rapidly than our ability to cope with the knowledge that we think we have. And so that condition, I think, spurs this condition of us constantly have to reinvest in what some people would call search, others would call research, some would call investigation, by all these different kinds of things, that the advancement of ignorance is actually a boundary which is exploding, and therefore our ability as a profession and as professionals to actually go behind this vacuum creates incredible opportunities, some funded and many not. But I think it's a challenge for younger people in the educational system to grapple with the fact that when I was going to school here, the illusion that one could master something was still firmly in place, and that one could gain ranking within a professional scale of mastery. And I think that's the thing that's kind of more or less gone, right? So that this kind of illusion, I think, has been like pulled down. But I think that's an important aspect of this discussion, which is that curtain has been pulled away, and so what is left in its wake for us to pursue.
Okay. Anyway, we are in time. Thank you so much to everyone.